The morning sun cut through Virginia humidity like a blade, casting long shadows across the training grounds of Marine Corps Base Quantico. It was 0600 hours, and the air already tasted of sweat, diesel, and ambition. Young Marines moved in synchronized formations, their boots hitting the pavement in rhythmic thunder, while drill instructors barked orders that echoed off the brick buildings surrounding the parade deck. Chen walked through the main gate with the kind of quietness that made people forget she was there. At 42, she wore civilian clothes. Faded jeans, a gray hoodie zipped her chin, and worn sneakers that had seen better days. Her black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, strands of silver catching the light. She carried no bags, no identification visible, nothing that suggested she belonged in this place where everything screamed military precision. The guard at the gate had waved her through with barely a glance after checking her visitor's pass. She was listed as a consultant for the new Special Operations Training Assessment, a vague title that explained nothing and everything at once. As she crossed the parade grounds, her eyes took in every detail with practiced efficiency. The way the recruits held their rifles, the slight hesitation in their movements, the overconfidence in their swagger. She'd seen it all before, decades ago, when she herself had stood where they stood now, believing she knew what strength meant. "Hey, ma'am." A voice called out from her left. Sarah turned to see 3 young Marines jogging toward her, their faces flushed from morning PT. The one in the middle, a tall kid with a Georgia accent thick as molasses, grinned widely. "You lost?" Visitor centers back that way. His buddies laughed, not unkindly. They were young, maybe 22, 23, with the kind of cockiness that came from surviving boot camp and thinking you'd conquered the world. Sarah smiled faintly. "I know where I'm going." "First day orientation?" Another asked, this one from somewhere in the Midwest, his blonde hair buzzed military short. "My sister's coming next month for the civilian liaison program." "That what you're here for?" She didn't answer, just kept that same slight smile on her face. The Marines exchanged glances, their grins widening. It wasn't malicious. They genuinely thought they were being helpful to what they assumed was a nervous civilian stumbling into their world. "Don't worry," the Georgian said, falling into step beside her despite her not asking for company. "First day's always the hardest. But hey, you're braver than most civilians. My mom visited once and wouldn't even get out of the car." He laughed at his own joke. Sarah let them talk. She'd learned long ago that silence revealed more than questions ever could. As they walked, more Marines noticed her, some offering polite nods, others barely registering her presence. She was just another civilian, probably someone's relative or a contractor here to discuss budgets and logistics. Nothing worth noting. The weather shifted as they crossed the grounds. Dark clouds rolled in from the east, carrying the promise of rain. The wind picked up cooler now, cutting through the humidity. Sarah felt it against her skin, familiar and grounding. She'd operated in worse conditions. Sandstorms in places that officially didn't exist, monsoons that turned missions into survival exercises, Arctic cold that made every breath a battle. The Georgia Marine was still talking. "And that's when the DI made us do burpees, until Williams threw up." Classic, right? "Hey, you meeting someone specific? Maybe we can help you find." "Attention!" The command cracked through the air like a whip. Everyone stopped. Sarah felt the shift in atmosphere before she saw its source. The 3 Marines beside her snapped to attention so fast she almost heard their spines straighten. The casual morning energy evaporated, replaced by something sharper, more focused. Colonel Richard Iron Mike Donovan was crossing parade grounds from the administrative building, his gait unmistakable even from a distance. At 71, he moved like a man 20 years younger, his back ramrod straight, his presence commanding space before he even spoke. He'd served for 50 years, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan, and carried the scars of every conflict in the lines of his weathered face and the steel of his eyes. He wasn't supposed to be here today. Retired for the past 3 years, Donovan only visited Quantico for special ceremonies, when called upon for his historical knowledge. But something had brought him in early this morning. A phone call from an old friend in the Pentagon who'd asked him to check on something peculiar. As he approached the small group, his eyes scanned the young Marines with the practiced assessment of someone who'd evaluated thousands of warriors in his lifetime. Then his gaze landed on Sarah. For a moment, nothing changed. Just an old colonel acknowledging a civilian visitor. Standard protocol. Then the wind gusted. Sarah's hoodie caught the breeze, and her left sleeve rode up just a few inches. Barely noticeable, maybe 3 or 4 seconds of exposure. But it was enough. Donovan's eyes locked onto her forearm. His stride faltered, then stopped completely. The tattoo was small, no larger than a silver dollar, positioned on the inside of her left forearm about 2 inches below her elbow. To anyone who didn't know, it might look like an abstract design, a circular emblem of what appeared to be a dying flame in the center, rendered in black ink so dark it seemed to absorb light. No words, no decorative elements. Just that simple, stark symbol, Black Ember. Donovan's face went pale beneath his tan. His jaw clenched. Sarah watched his reaction with the same calm expression she'd worn since entering the base, but something shifted in her eyes. Recognition meeting recognition. The young Marines noticed their colonel had stopped moving. The Georgian started to speak. "Sir, we were just helping this." "Dismissed." Donovan's voice was quiet, but absolute. "Now." They scattered without question, confusion written across their faces as they jogged away, glancing back over their shoulders at the strange civilian who'd somehow made Iron Mike Donovan look like he'd seen a ghost. For a long moment, neither Sarah nor Donovan moved. The parade grounds continued around them. Marines training, vehicles passing, the normal rhythm of military life. But in that small pocket of space, time seemed suspended. Finally, Donovan raised his right hand. Slowly, deliberately, he brought it to his forehead in a salute, so precise it could have been photographed for a manual. His hand trembled slightly, the only outward sign of a shock. Sarah's expression didn't change, but she returned the salute with equal precision, her movements carrying the kind of economy that came from muscle memory drilled so deep it became instinct. "Ma'am," Donovan said, his voice rough with emotion he was fighting to control. Colonel Richard Donovan. It's an honor." "Sarah Chen," she replied simply, pulling her sleeve back down. "Though I'm guessing you already knew that." "I knew someone was coming. They didn't say who." He glanced around the parade grounds at all the young faces go about their morning routines, completely unaware of what was happening. "Does anyone else know you're here?" "Just the people who need to." Donovan nodded slowly, his mind clearly racing. How many years has it been since Black Ember was officially dissolved? 16 years, 2 months, 11 days. The precision of her answer told him everything he needed to know about how much that date mattered to her. Black Ember hadn't just been dissolved. It had been erased. Every operation redacted. Every member scattered to the winds with new identities and lives they had to build from scratch. The unit had never officially existed, which meant its warriors could never officially be honored. "How many of you are left?" Donovan asked quietly. Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Fewer than when we started." The implications hung heavy in the humid air. Black Ember had been comprised of exactly 40 operators when it was formed, men and women selected for capabilities that went beyond physical prowess into psychological warfare, linguistic mastery, and a kind of moral flexibility required to do things that kept politicians sleeping soundly at night. They'd operated in 17 countries across 4 continents, completing missions that prevented wars, toppled regimes, and saved thousands of lives that would never know how close they'd come to disaster. They'd also suffered casualties that could never be publicly mourned. "I heard rumors," Donovan said, his voice dropping even lower, "about Azerbaijan, about what happened in that compound." Sarah's face remained impassive, but her left hand unconsciously moved to her ribs, where a scar from a blade wound still ached when the weather changed. "Rumors are all anyone should hear about that." "Right." Donovan cleared his throat, pulling himself back into the present. "You're here for the assessment review?" "Something like that." He studied her for a moment longer, seeing past the civilian clothes and quiet demeanor to the warrior beneath. Then he straightened, military bearing returning. "Ma'am, With your permission, I'd like to properly introduce you to the command staff. There are people here who should know what you represent." Sarah shook her head. "That's not why I'm here, Colonel. I'm here to observe. Nothing more. With respect, ma'am, your presence alone is worth more than any observation report. These kids," he gestured at the Marines training around them, "they need to see what real service looks like. Not the recruiting posters. Not the Hollywood version. The real thing." Before Sarah could respond, a sharp whistle cut through the air. Both of them turned to see a formation of Marines assembling near the obstacle course. Their instructor, a stocky gunnery sergeant with arms like tree trunks, shouting commands that carried across the grounds. Among them were the 3 Marines who'd helped Sarah earlier. They were stealing glances in her direction, clearly confused about why their colonel was still talking to the random civilian woman. Donovan noticed their attention. A slight smile crossed his weathered face. "They have no idea, do they? They're not supposed to. Maybe they should be." He turned to face her fully, and now his expression carried the weight of his 50 years of service. "Sarah Chen, Master Sergeant, though that rank doesn't even begin to cover what you've done. Fluent in 9 languages, expert in asymmetrical warfare, counterintelligence, and urban infiltration. 47 successful operations in countries that would start wars if anyone knew we'd been there. 3 silver stars that can never be officially awarded. 2 Purple Hearts earned in battles that officially never happened. And the only woman to ever complete the Black Ember selection process without a single recycle." Sarah's expression finally shifted. A flash of discomfort at having her service laid out so plainly. "You've done your homework. I made some calls after I got the notification someone was coming. Pulled in favors from people who owe me." He paused. "What they told me barely scratched the surface, didn't it?" She didn't answer, which was answer enough. The rain finally came, fat droplets that started slow, then built into a steady downpour within seconds. The Marines on the obstacle course continued their training without breaking stride, now slipping and sliding in the mud, their instructor's voice rising to be heard over the drumming water. Sarah stood in the rain without flinching, letting it soak through her hoodie. Donovan stayed beside her, equally unbothered. They were both people who'd learned long ago that weather was just another variable to be managed, not something that determined your actions. "Why now?" Donovan finally asked. "Why come back after all these years?" Sarah watched the young Marines struggling through the obstacle course, their faces set with determination as they climbed over walls and crawled through mud. She saw her younger self in her movements, that same desperate need to prove something, to be worthy of the uniform. "Because someone needs to make sure we're still preparing them for what's actually out there," she said quietly. "Not what we wish was out there." Donovan understood immediately. The gap between training and reality, between what politicians promised and what warriors faced, had always existed, but it had grown wider in recent years, as warfare itself evolved into something more complex, more shadowy, more morally ambiguous than ever before. "You're here to fix that?" "I'm here to assess whether it can be fixed." Sarah finally looked at him directly. "And if I'm being honest, Colonel, I'm not optimistic." The rain intensified, turning the parade grounds into a waterlogged mess. Lightning flashed in the distance, followed seconds later by the low rumble of thunder. Through it all, the training continued, because that's what Marines did. They continued. Donovan made a decision. "Ma'am, you may want to observe quietly, but I'm formally requesting you address the advanced training class this afternoon. Let them see what they're aspiring to become." "That's not. It's exactly what you're here for, whether you want to admit it or not." His voice carried the firm edge of command. "These Marines deserve to know that people like you exist, that the sacrifices are real, and so are the warriors who make them." Sarah held his gaze for a long moment. Around them, the base continued its morning rhythm. Marines training, officers hurrying between buildings with folders held over their heads against the rain, vehicles splashing through puddles. Normal. Routine. Except nothing about this moment was routine. 1,400 hours, she finally said. Conference room C. But I'm not wearing the uniform, and I'm not telling war stories. Understood, ma'am. Donovan saluted again, and this time Sarah returned it without hesitation. as the colonel walked away, disappearing into the rain toward the administrative building. Sarah stood alone in the downpour. She looked down at her left forearm, at the sleeve now plastered her skin by the rain, hiding the tattoo underneath, Black Ember, a symbol of fire that had burned so hot it consumed everything, leaving only dark ash behind. That's what they'd been, the aftermath of the flame, the shadow left when the light went out. The operators who did things that would make other special forces operators refuse the mission. And now she was back, standing in the place where it had all begun, watching a new generation prepare for battles they couldn't yet imagine. Sarah finally moved, heading toward the building that housed the assessment offices. As she walked, Marines passed in the rain, some nodding politely, others ignoring her completely. None of them knew. None of them understood that they'd just walked past someone who'd shaped modern warfare in ways that would never make it into any official history. The young Georgian Marine from earlier jogged past, noticed her, and called out with a friendly grin. "Told you first days are tough. Hang in there." Sarah smiled faintly and kept walking. If only he knew that her first day, her real first day, had started with a 30-mile ruck march through the Nevada desert, carrying 80 pounds of gear, followed by 48 hours of interrogation resistance training that left her voice gone for a week. This was just another morning. But as she reached the door and pulled it open, she caught her reflection in the glass. And for just a second, she saw the young woman she'd been 25 years ago, standing in the same spot, terrified and determined and naive enough to think she understood what service meant. That woman was gone now, burned away in the ember, leaving only the shadow behind. Sarah stepped inside, ready to begin the assessment that would determine the future of a new generation of warriors. The question was, would they be ready for the truth? The rain had stopped by late morning, leaving the ground to Quantico steaming under a sun that broke through the clouds with aggressive intensity. The humidity climbed back to uncomfortable levels, making every breath feel thick and heavy. In enlisted barracks, word was spreading faster than wildfire through dry brush. Lance Corporal Marcus Webb sat on his bunk, scrolling through his phone while half listening to the conversation exploding around him. At 23, he was in his second year with the Corps, assigned to the Security Forces Regiment, and convinced he had this military thing figured out. He'd survived deployment to the Mediterranean, earned his rifle expert badge, and was being considered for specialized training. In his mind, he was on the fast track. "I'm telling you, man," Iron Mike saluted her. Private First Class Danny Rodriguez was practically vibrating with excitement as he recounted what he'd witnessed that morning. Like, full-on regulation salute. And he looked like he'd seen a ghost. Staff Sergeant Jerome Williams, a 7-year veteran lounging in the corner with a worn paperback. Didn't even look up. You probably saw wrong. Colonel Donovan salutes visiting officers all the time. She wasn't in uniform. Danny insisted. That's the point. She was in jeans and a hoodie, looking like somebody's mom who got lost on the way to the commissary. We literally asked her if it was her first day. That got Williams's attention. He lowered his book. "You what?" "We were trying to be helpful," Marcus finally chimed in, set his phone aside. He'd been one of the 3 Marines who'd approached the woman. She seemed confused, so we walked with her for a bit. She barely said anything, just smiled and kept walking. And then Colonel Donovan saw her and froze. Danny continued. "I mean, the man's fought in like 5 wars, and I've never seen him look shook. But this woman, whoever she is, made him stop dead in his tracks." Corporal Lisa Chong, sitting cross-legged on her bunk while cleaning her rifle, spoke up without pausing her work. "Did anyone actually get a good look at her? Description?" Marcus tried to recall details. "Asian American, maybe. 40-something. Black hair with some gray. Average height, kind of thin. Nothing special, honestly. That's why we thought she was new." "Nothing special," Williams repeated slowly, that tone in his voice that suggested he was about to deliver a teaching moment. And yet a full-bird colonel who forgot more about warfare than we'll ever know saluted her like she was the commandant. The barracks went quiet for a moment, the weight of that observation sinking in. "Think she's CIA?" Another Marine asked from across the room. "Or maybe contractor, one of those high-level consultants who briefed the brass." William stood up, his 6'4" frame unfolding with the kind of presence that made younger Marines instinctively straighten. Or maybe, and I'm just spitballing here, she's someone who actually earned that salute, and you idiots walked right past her making first aid jokes. Marcus felt his stomach drop. You think she's, what? Some kind of operator? I think, William said carefully, that if Colonel Donovan reacted that way, she's either someone important enough that we should know her name, or important enough that we shouldn't. And I'm betting it's the latter. Danny pulled out his phone, fingers flying across the screen. I'm looking up civilian consultants assigned to Quantico. Maybe she's on a roster somewhere. She won't be, Chong said, finally looking up from her rifle. If she's what we think she is, there won't be any roster. No records. Nothing you can Google. How would you know? Marcus asked. Chong met his eyes with the kind of steady gaze that reminded everyone she'd scored highest in their class on tactical intelligence assessment. Because that's the whole point of people like that. They don't exist on paper. They're ghosts who do the jobs that can't be officially authorized. The conversation was interrupted by the door slamming open. Gunnery Sergeant Patricia Hayes strode in, her presence immediately commanding attention. At 38, she was Marine's Marine, tough, fair, and impossible to bullshit. She'd done 3 tours in Afghanistan and had the kind of reputation that made even officers think twice before crossing her. Listen up, she barked, and every conversation died instantly. There's a briefing at 1,400 hours for advanced training candidates. Conference Room C. Attendance is mandatory. She paused, her eyes scanning the room. And for those of you who've been running your mouths about Colonel Donovan and a certain visitor, shut it. You want to know who she is? Show up to the briefing, and maybe you'll find out. She left as quickly as she'd entered, the door swinging shut behind her. The barracks exploded into speculation. By 13:30 hours, the hallway outside Conference Room C was packed. What was supposed to be a briefing for 20 advanced training candidates had somehow become the worst-kept secret on base. Nearly 60 Marines crowded the corridor, some officially invited, others claiming they'd heard they were supposed to attend, and a few who'd simply shown up out of curiosity. Marcus stood near the front, trying to look like he belonged there despite not being formally invited. Next to him, Danny was bouncing on his heels with nervous energy. You think she'll actually show? Danny whispered. Before Marcus could answer, the crowd suddenly quieted. The shift in atmosphere was palpable, like the air pressure dropping before a storm. Marcus turned to see why. Colonel Donovan was walking down the hallway, and beside him was the woman from that morning. She still wore civilian clothes, the hoodie replaced by a simple black t-shirt and the same jeans, but something about her had changed. Maybe it was the lighting, or maybe it was the context, but she didn't look like someone's lost mom anymore. She looked focused, purposeful, like a blade being drawn from its sheath. As they passed, Marines instinctively straightened, though she held no rank that required it. It wasn't her appearance that commanded their attention. It was something else, something harder to define. An aura of competence so absolute it needed no announcement. She noticed Marcus as they passed, made eye contact, gave him the same faint smile from that morning. Except now, that smile felt different, like she'd known all along exactly what they'd been thinking, and found it quietly amusing. Marcus felt his face heat up with embarrassment. The doors to Conference Room C opened, and Donovan gestured for the woman to enter first. As they disappeared inside, Gunnery Sergeant Hayes emerged, clipboard in hand. Advanced candidates only, she announced. Everyone else, clear out. Now! The hallway emptied reluctantly, disappointed Marines filing away while throwing looks back at the closed door. Marcus was about to leave when Hayes called out, Webb, Rodriguez, Carter, you 3 stay. Marcus's stomach dropped again. They were the 3 who'd talked to her that morning. Once the hallway was clear, Hayes opened the door and jerked her head toward the room. Inside, and Webb, whatever you're about to hear, I suggest you listen with your mouth shut and your brain engaged for once. Conference Room C was designed for tactical briefings, with a long table, projection screen, and walls covered in maps and strategic diagrams. 22 Marines sat in chairs arranged in rows, all of them in the advanced training pipeline. the Corps' best and brightest, being groomed for leadership or specialized roles. The woman stood at the front of the room beside Colonel Donovan, her arms crossed, studying each face with a kind of systematic assessment that made everyone feel simultaneously evaluated and cataloged. Donovan spoke first. "At ease, Marines. I know most of you expected a different briefing today. Consider this an educational opportunity." He paused. "The woman standing here has agreed, reluctantly, to share some perspective on what modern warfare actually looks like beyond what your manuals and instructors teach you." Someone in the back raised their hand. "Sir, with respect, who is she?" Donovan looked at Sarah, giving her the floor. She uncrossed her arms and stepped forward, her voice calm and clear. "My name is Sarah Chen. I served for 18 years in positions I can't name, conducting operations I can't describe, in countries I can't identify. When I was your age, I thought I knew what it meant to be a warrior. I was wrong." The room was silent. Every eye locked on her. "3 of you approached me this morning," she continued, and Marcus felt multiple pairs of eyes turned toward him. "Asked if it was my first day. You were being kind, trying to help what you assumed was a lost civilian. I appreciated the gesture." She paused. "But I want you to understand something critical. In the field, assumptions get people killed." She pulled up her left sleeve, revealing the Black Ember tattoo. Most of the Marines stared at it without recognition. It was just an interesting design to them. But Marcus noticed that 2 people in the room had very different reactions. Staff Sergeant Williams had gone rigid, his eyes wide. And in the back corner, a female captain Marcus didn't recognize had actually stood up, her hand moving unconsciously to her chest in what might have been the beginning of a salute before she caught herself. "Some of you recognize this mark," Sarah said quietly. "Most of you don't. That's intentional. This tattoo represents a unit that officially never existed, conducting operations that officially never happened. 40 people wore this mark. 23 of us are still alive." The math hit hard. Nearly half casualties in a unit that wasn't even supposed to exist. "I'm not here to tell you war stories or make myself look heroic," Sarah continued. "I'm here because the gap between what you're being trained for and what you'll actually face is growing. Modern warfare isn't about formations and flag waving anymore. It's about operating in gray spaces, making impossible decisions with incomplete information, and living with consequences that will never make the news." She began pacing slowly, her movements economical. "You're being taught tactics, weapon systems, command structure, all important. But what you're not being taught enough of is the psychological reality, the moral weight. What it feels like to complete a mission successfully and still wake up 20 years later wondering if you made the right call." Marcus found himself leaning forward, completely absorbed. "Let me tell you about Azerbaijan," Sarah said, her voice dropping. "In 2009, there was a compound outside Baku where a terrorist cell was planning attacks on 3 European embassies. Intelligence indicated 47 operatives inside, armed with weapons and explosives. My team went in to neutralize the threat." She paused. "When we breached, we found 46 combatants, and one 12-year-old boy who was there because his father was one of the cell leaders." The room was so quiet Marcus could hear his own heartbeat. The rules of engagement were clear. The mission parameters were clear. But in that moment, looking at a terrified child holding a phone that might have been a detonator, nothing was clear. I had 3 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether that boy lived or died, whether my team lived or died, whether those embassy attacks happened or not. She stopped pacing, standing perfectly still. "What would you do?" No one answered. The question hung in the air, heavy and impossible. "The boy wasn't holding a detonator," Sarah finally said. "He was calling his mother. We secured him, completed the mission, and got him to safety. But I made that decision based on a gut instinct built from years of experience reading people under stress. What if I had been wrong? What if my instinct had failed? What if he had been holding a trigger?" She looked around the room. "That's the reality you're training for. Not the tactics. Not the weapons. The moments where every choice is a wrong choice, and you still have to choose." Marcus felt something shift in his understanding. This wasn't a pep talk or a recruitment pitch. This was a warning. "I've killed people," Sarah said bluntly. 17 to be exact. Some up close, some from a distance. All of them threats to national security. All of them people I'd do anything to have not killed. Her voice remained steady, but Marcus saw something flicker in her eyes. Pain, quickly controlled. You're going to train for victory. You're going to celebrate your qualifications and promotions. But no one's going to train you for the weight of those choices, for the faces you'll see when you try to sleep, for the person you'll become. Colonel Donovan, who'd been standing silently to the side, finally spoke. Master Sergeant Chen has agreed to remain at Quantico for the next month to assist with assessment and training evaluation. She'll be observing your advanced courses and providing feedback to command staff. I expect you to treat her presence with the respect it deserves. Sarah held up a hand. I don't want respect for who I was. If you respect anything, respect the lessons. Learn from people who've been there. Ask hard questions. Challenge your assumptions. Because the enemy won't give you the courtesy of being what you expect. A Marine near the front finally raised her hand. Ma'am, why tell us this? Why not just let us learn through experience? Sarah's expression softened slightly. Because I buried 17 members of my unit, and every single one of them died because they weren't prepared for the reality of what we were doing. I'm telling you this because maybe, if you understand what you're walking into, fewer of your friends will end up in flag-draped coffins. The briefing continued for another 40 minutes. Sarah answered questions, carefully, always aware of what she couldn't reveal, and shared insights into psychological operations, cultural intelligence, language acquisition, and the importance of understanding motivation over simply following orders. When it finally ended and Marines began filing out, Marcus lingered, waiting until he could approach her. Ma'am, he said, his voice uncertain. This morning you were being Marines, Sarah said simply. Confident, maybe overconfident, but trying to help. Nothing wrong with that. Except we completely misread the situation. Everyone misreads situations. The key is learning to adjust once you realize your mistake. She studied him for a moment. You're Marcus Webb, Lance Corporal, rifle expert, recommended for intelligence training. Your instructors say you have potential but need to learn humility. Marcus blinked, startled that she knew so much. Yes, ma'am. Humility isn't weakness, Sarah said. It's survival. Remember that. As Marcus left the conference room, his head spinning with everything he'd heard, he realized that his entire understanding of what it meant to serve had just been fundamentally challenged. And somewhere deep down, he was grateful for it. Because for the first time since joining the Corps, he felt like someone had told him the truth. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent toward evening, casting long shadows across Quantico. The base continued its daily rhythm, training, drilling, preparing. But for the Marines who'd been in that conference room, something had shifted. They'd met a ghost. And ghosts, Marcus was learning, had stories worth listening to. 3 weeks into Sarah Chen's stay at Quantico, the base had settled into an uneasy equilibrium. She moved through the grounds like smoke, present but intangible, observing everything while disturbing nothing. Most Marines had heard about her by now, though the details remained frustratingly vague. Some called her the consultant. Others whispered Black Ember, with the kind of reverence usually reserved for Medal of Honor recipients. Marcus Webb had been assigned as her unofficial liaison, a role that felt equal parts honor and punishment. He'd spend hours escorting her to various training exercises, watching her watch the Marines, trying to decipher what she was actually thinking behind those dark, assessing eyes. It was a Thursday morning when everything changed. The Advanced Combat Training Course was in full swing at the Urban Warfare Facility, a mock town built to simulate Middle Eastern architecture, complete with tight alleyways, multi-story buildings, and hidden rooms designed to test a Marine's tactical decision-making under pressure. 20 Marines were running the exercise, divided into 4-person fire teams tasked with clearing buildings and neutralizing hostile targets. Sarah stood in the observation tower alongside the training instructors, watching through reinforced glass as the exercise unfolded below. Marcus stood beside her, trying to see what she was seeing. Blue team, moving a breach on my mark. A voice crackled over the radio. Sergeant Jake Morrison, a 6-year veteran with 2 deployments under his belt, was leading his fire team toward a 2-story building at the center of the mock town. They moved with practiced efficiency, covering angles, communicated with hand signals, their weapons up and ready. Sarah's expression remained neutral, but Marcus noticed her jaw tighten slightly. The breach happened fast. Flashbang to the window. Door kicked open, Marines flooding in with practiced speed. Simunition rounds, paintball-like projectiles designed for training, began flying. Pop, pop, pop. The sound echoed through the facility. Contact. 2nd floor. Covering. Room clear, moving. It was textbook. Exactly what they'd been trained to do. The instructors nodded with approval. Sarah pressed a button on the console in front of her. Stop the exercise. The instructors turned to her, confused. The Marine running the control panel hesitated. Ma'am, they're in the middle of... Stop it. Now. Something in her voice made him comply. The radio crackled. All teams freeze in place. Exercise paused. Below, the Marine stopped mid-movement, confusion evident even from the observation tower. Morrison's voice came through the radio. Control, what's the issue? We haven't completed the objective. Sarah picked up the radio handset. Sergeant Morrison, how many hostiles have you neutralized so far? A pause. 3 confirmed, ma'am. 2 on 1st floor, 1 on 2nd. And how many civilians did you clear from the building before engaging? Longer pause. Ma'am, the briefing indicated this was a hostile-held structure with no civilian presence. The briefing was incomplete. Sarah's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. In the room you just cleared on the 2nd floor, there were 2 non-combatants hiding under a table. You fired 14 rounds into that space. In a real scenario, what would have happened? The silence on the radio was deafening. Sarah set down the handset and turned to the senior instructor, a grizzled major named Patterson who'd been running this course for 8 years. With respect, sir, your scenarios are training them to get people killed. Patterson's face reddened. Ma'am, these exercises are designed based on real-world combat situations. Real-world combat situations where the intelligence is perfect, where every hostile is where they're supposed to be, and every civilian has been conveniently evacuated. Sarah's voice never rose, but the intensity increased. That's not real world. That's fantasy. She walked to the control panel, pointing at the layout of the mock town on the screen. In Fallujah, we breached a building based on intelligence that said 3 combatants, no civilians. We found 7 combatants and 4 children who'd been too scared to evacuate. In Kandahar, we cleared a compound where every room was supposed to be empty. There were families in 3 of them who'd returned after curfew because their grandmother was dying. Marcus watched the instructors' faces. They were listening now, really listening. You're teaching them speed and aggression, Sarah continued. Those are important, but you're not teaching them doubt. You're not teaching them to question their briefings, to slow down when something feels wrong, to verify before they commit. She turned back to the window, looking down at the frozen Marines below. And that's going to get people killed, our people, and the people we're supposed to be protecting. Major Patterson was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he said, What would you do differently? Sarah picked up the radio again. All teams, return to starting positions. We'll run this exercise again, but this time I'm writing the scenario. Over the next hour, Sarah transformed the exercise into something none of the Marines had experienced before. She added variables, changed the briefings mid-mission, placed non-combatant role players in unexpected locations, created situations where the right tactical decision could have devastating humanitarian consequences. Marcus watched Morrison's team struggle through the new scenario. They breached a room expecting hostiles and found a family with children. They hesitated, unsure whether to treat them as potential threats or victims. That hesitation saved lives in the simulation, but left them vulnerable to the actual combatant who appeared from a hidden position moments later. Morrison took a simulated kill shot to the chest. You're dead. Sarah's voice came through the radio. Your team is down 1 operator because you were too slow to assess the threat. But the family is alive. Was that trade worth it? No answer. There was no good answer. After the exercise ended, Sarah gathered all 20 Marines in the debriefing room. They sat in chairs arranged in a circle, their uniforms stained with paint from simulated rounds, their faces showing a mix of frustration and confusion. "Show of hands," Sarah said, standing in the center. "How many of you felt like you failed today?" Every hand went up. "Good. Now you're learning." She began walking the circle, making eye contact with each Marine as she passed. "You've been trained to succeed, to complete the objective, to win. But real warfare isn't about winning exercises. It's about making choices in incomplete information environments where success and failure aren't clearly defined." She stopped in front of Morrison. "Sergeant, you took a simulated kill because you hesitated. If this had been real, you'd be dead and your team would be down an operator. What did you learn?" Morrison's jaw worked for a moment before he answered that protecting civilians and protecting my team can be competing priorities. And there's no training manual that tells you how to choose." Sarah nodded. "Correct. There's no manual because every situation is different. Every choice you make creates consequences you can't predict." She addressed the entire room. "The military trains you to be decisive, to act with confidence. Those are good qualities. But they can also get you killed if you're decisive about the wrong thing." A female Marine near the back raised her hand. Corporal Jennifer Hassan, a linguist with a deployment to Jordan behind her. "Ma'am, how do you balance speed with caution? In the field, hesitation can be just as deadly as making the wrong choice." "You're right," Sarah acknowledged. "And that's the hardest part. There's no formula. It comes from experience, from cultural awareness, from learning to read situations faster than your training has prepared you for." She paused. "It also comes from being willing to be wrong and learning from it without letting it destroy you. Is that what happened to you?" The question came from Marcus before he could stop himself. "Did you make wrong choices?" The room went silent. Several Marines shot Marcus looks that clearly said he'd crossed a line, but Sarah didn't seem offended. She turned to face him directly. "Yes, multiple times." "Can you tell us about one?" For a long moment, Sarah didn't answer. Her eyes went distant, seeing something none of them could see. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter. "Tunisia, 2007. We were tracking a cell leader who was coordinating attacks on diplomatic targets. Intelligence indicated he was moving between safe houses in a residential district of Tunis. We set up observation on a house where he was supposed to appear." She paused, her hands unconsciously clenching. "On the third day, we got confirmation he was inside. The order came down to neutralize the threat. Marcus realized he was holding his breath. We breached at 0300 hours. 4-person team. I went in first." Sarah's voice had taken on a mechanical quality, as if she were reading from a report. "The target was in the second-floor bedroom. We confirmed identity and engaged. Mission successful. Target eliminated." She stopped walking. "What we found out 3 days later was that the confirmation was wrong. The man we killed looked like the target. Similar build, similar face, but he was a teacher, a civilian. He'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time, sleeping in a room that happened to be in a house that intelligence had marked as a safe house. The room was absolutely still. The real target was in a different house, 2 blocks away. We'd been watching the wrong location because someone had transposed 2 numbers in an address." Sarah's voice cracked slightly on the last word, the only sign of emotion breaking through. "I killed an innocent man because I trusted the intelligence without verifying, because I was decisive instead of cautious. Marcus felt like he'd been punched in the gut. What happened after?" Morrison asked quietly. "Nothing," Sarah said. "Officially, it never happened. The mission was classified. The man's death was blamed on local violence. His family never knew the truth." She finally looked up, meeting their eyes again. "And I have to live with that. Every day, for the rest of my life." Corporal Hassan spoke into the heavy silence. "Ma'am, with respect, that wasn't your fault. You were following orders based on the intelligence you were given. Following orders doesn't absolve you of responsibility for your actions. Sarah's voice was firm again. The momentary vulnerability locked back down. I pulled the trigger. I made the decision to trust the intelligence without pushing for verification. Those were my choices, and that man is dead because of them. She addressed the whole room again. This is what I need you to understand. You will make mistakes. Some of those mistakes will have consequences you can never fix. The question isn't whether you'll have to live with those consequences. You will. The question is whether you'll let them make you a better operator, or whether they'll destroy you. Major Patterson, who'd been standing silently in the doorway throughout the debriefing, finally spoke. Master Sergeant Chen, if you could change how we train these Marines, what would you do? Sarah thought for a moment. I'd introduce more chaos, more ambiguity, more scenarios where there is no right answer, only less wrong ones. I'd train them to question their briefings, to verify their intelligence, to slow down when their instincts are screaming that something's wrong. She paused. And I make sure they understand that their decisions have moral weight that doesn't disappear just because they were following orders. Patterson nodded slowly. Consider it done. Starting next week, you're redesigning the urban warfare curriculum. Sarah looked surprised for the first time since arriving in Quantico. Sir, I'm only here as an observer. You're here as whatever I need you to be. And right now, I need you to make sure these Marines are ready for the real world. Patterson's expression was firm. You've got carte blanche. Build the training you wish you'd had. That evening, Marcus found Sarah sitting alone on a bench near the rifle range, watching the sun set over the Virginia hills. The sky was painted in oranges and purples, the kind of beautiful sunset that felt incongruous with the weight of the conversation they'd had earlier. Ma'am, he said, approaching cautiously. Mind if I join you? She gestured to the empty space on the bench. They sat in silence for a few minutes, watching the light fade. Finally, Marcus worked up the courage to speak. What you told us today about Tunisia, that took guts. Most people wouldn't admit something like that. Most people don't have to, Sarah replied. Most people's mistakes don't end with someone dead. Still, it means something that you're trying to prevent us from making the same mistakes. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. You know what the worst part is? I've told that story before to other classes, other Marines, and every single time, I hope that maybe this time it'll make a difference. That maybe one person will remember it when they're in a similar situation, and they'll verify their intelligence. They'll slow down. They'll question. She shook her head. But I don't know if it actually helps. I don't know if anything I'm doing here actually matters. It matters to us, Marcus said firmly. It matters to every person in that room today who's going to think twice before trusting a briefing. Who's going to remember that there are real people on the other end of our decisions. Maybe, Sarah said. Or maybe they'll forget as soon as the adrenaline starts pumping and the bullets start flying. Maybe training can only take you so far. Then why are you here? The question hung in the air between them. Sarah turned to look at him, really look at him, and for a moment Marcus saw past the hardened operator to the person underneath. Someone who was tired, who carried more weight than any person should have to carry, but who kept showing up anyway. Because I have to believe it makes a difference, she finally said. Because if it doesn't, if all of this is meaningless, then everyone I've lost died for nothing, and I can't accept that. The sun disappeared behind the hills, leaving them in the gathering darkness. In the distance, they could hear Marines calling cadence during an evening run. The sounds of preparation. The sound of warriors training for battles that might never come, or might come tomorrow. For what it's worth, Marcus said quietly, I think they died for something. Because you're here. Because you're making sure the next generation does better. Sarah didn't respond, but Marcus saw her jaw clench with emotion. She was fighting control. They sat together in the darkness until the first stars appeared. Two people connected by the weight of service, and the shared understanding that some burdens could never be put down, only carried day after day, with a hope that the carrying itself meant something. The final week of Sarah Chen's assessment at Quantico arrived with the kind of humid heat that made the Virginia summer feel oppressive. For weeks had passed since that morning when 3 Marines had asked if it was her first day, and everything had changed. The training programs had been overhauled. The scenarios have been rewritten, and the Marines have been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the gap between training and reality. But Sarah knew her time here was ending. Soon she'd return to whatever civilian life she'd built for herself after Black Ember, a life none of these Marines would ever know about. The question was whether anything she'd done here would last after she left. Colonel Donovan had requested one final briefing, this time not just for advanced candidates, but for the entire command staff. Captains, majors, lieutenant colonels, everyone involved in training the next generation of Marine warriors. The conference room was packed, standing room only, with officers who'd rearranged their schedules to attend. Sarah stood at the front of the room with a presentation remote in her hand, though she hadn't turned on projector yet. Instead, she was studying the faces looking back at her, some curious, some skeptical, some already convinced they knew better than the civilian consultant what Marines needed. 4 weeks ago, she began, I arrived at this base expecting to confirm what I already suspected, that we're training warriors for wars that no longer exist. She paused. I was partially right, but I was also wrong. That got their attention. You are training warriors for wars that no longer exist, she continued. But you're also training warriors who are capable of adapting, of learning, of becoming something more than what their manual tells them to be. The question is whether you're giving them permission to do that. She clicked the remote. The first slide appeared, a photo of a compound in Azerbaijan, taken from satellite imagery. Most of the people in the room wouldn't recognize it, but she saw several older officers stiffen in recognition. 2009, Azerbaijan. Black Ember's final official operation. Sarah's voice remained steady despite the memories threatening to surface. 47 hostile combatants. 1 civilian child. My team went in to neutralize the threat and extract any non-combatants. She paused. We succeeded. All hostiles neutralized. Child extracted safely. Mission complete. She clicked to the next slide. This one showed casualty reports, heavily redacted, names blacked out. 3 months later, 4 members of my team were dead. 2 by suicide. 1 from an overdose that was probably intentional. 1 from a car accident that might not have been an accident. Her voice never wavered. None of those casualties happened in combat. They happened back home, in the quiet moments when the missions were over and they had to live with what they'd done. The room was silent. We train Marines to fight, Sarah continued. We train them to shoot, to move, to communicate, to complete the mission. We give them the best tactical education in the world. But we don't train them for what comes after. We don't train them to process the moral weight of their decisions. We don't train them to reintegrate into a world that can never understand what they've experienced. We don't train them to survive the peace. She clicked through several more slides, each showing statistics on veteran mental health, suicide rates, substance abuse, PTSD diagnoses. The numbers were staggering. These are your warriors, Sarah said. The ones who survived the combat and came home. These are the people we're failing. A major in the 3rd row raised his hand. Ma'am, with respect, we have psychological support services, counseling, mental health resources. We take these issues seriously. Do you? Sarah challenged. Or do you pay lip service to mental health while simultaneously promoting a culture that treats seeking help as weakness? How many of your Marines have been told to suck it up when they express struggles? How many have watched their peers get passed over for promotion because they sought counseling? The major didn't answer. Sarah softened her tone slightly. I'm not saying you're doing it wrong intentionally. I'm saying the system is built on a contradiction. We ask people to do things that will fundamentally change them, and then we expect them to pretend nothing changed. That's not sustainable. She clicked to a new slide. This one showed a training framework she developed over the past 4 weeks, incorporating psychological resilience, moral injury recognition, and cultural intelligence into the standard tactical curriculum. This is what I'm proposing, Sarah said. Not as a replacement for your current training, but as an addition. Integrate these elements throughout the pipeline, from boot camp through advanced schools. Make them as fundamental as weapons proficiency or physical fitness. For the next 45 minutes, Sarah walked them through the framework. She showed data from pilot programs in other military branches. She presented case studies of Marines who'd gone through enhanced psychological training and how it had affected their performance and long-term well-being. She fielded questions, pushback, skepticism, and occasional support. When she finally finished, Colonel Donovan stood up from where he'd been sitting in the back. "I've been in the Corps for 50 years, he said, his voice carrying the authority of those decades. "I've seen us adapt to new weapons, new tactics, new enemies. But Master Sergeant Chen is right. We haven't adapted to this. We're still trying to produce warriors using a model that worked when wars were simpler and enemies were clearer." He paused. "I'm recommending we implement this framework on a trial basis, starting with the next advanced training cycle. And I'm recommending that Master Sergeant Chen be contracted to oversee the implementation." Sarah's eyes widened slightly. That wasn't what they'd discussed. Several officers began speaking at once, some in support, others raising concerns about funding, logistics, tradition. Donovan raised a hand for silence. "This isn't optional," he said firmly. "The Commandant has already reviewed the proposal and given preliminary approval. The only question is how we implement it, not whether we do." He looked directly at Sarah. "Ma'am, I know you came here for a 4-week assessment. I'm asking you to stay for at least 6 months. Help us get this right." Sarah stood frozen, the weight of the request settling on her shoulders. 6 more months at Quantico. 6 more months of reliving her past, of being surrounded by reminders of what she'd lost, of carrying the responsibility for shaping the next generation. She thought of the 23 Black Ember operators still alive, scattered across the country, trying to build civilian lives from the ashes of their service. She thought of the 17 who hadn't made it. She thought of the teacher in Tunisia whose name she'd never learned, but whose face she saw every time she closed her eyes. "On one condition," Sarah finally said, "I want access to Black Ember survivors. The ones who are willing to talk, who might be willing to contribute to the training. Their experiences, their perspectives, they're more valuable than mine alone." Donovan nodded immediately. "Done. I'll make the calls." That night, Marcus found Sarah in the base gym long after hours, working a heavy bag with methodical precision. He'd been looking for her to deliver a message from Gunnery Sergeant Hayes, but he stopped in the doorway, watching her work. Every movement was economical, no wasted energy, just controlled power delivered with perfect technique, over and over. Jab, cross, hook, each strike making the heavy bag swing on its chain. Her breathing was steady, her face expressionless, but Marcus could see the tension in her shoulders, the weight she was trying to punch away. He waited until she paused, breathing hard, her hands wrapped in gauze. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "Gunny Hayes wanted me to tell you that the first cohort for the new training framework has been selected. 25 Marines. They start Monday." Sarah grabbed a towel, wiping sweat from her face. That was fast. Colonel Donovan doesn't mess around when he makes a decision. Marcus hesitated, then added, "For what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing. Staying. Do you?" Sarah's voice was neutral. "Or do you think I'm just someone who can't let go of the past?" The question was direct enough that Marcus took a moment to consider his answer carefully. "I think you're someone who's trying to make sure the past means something. That's different than not letting go." Sarah pulled off her hand wraps, examining the gauze for blood spots. Old habit from years of training. "You know what scares me? That I'll pour everything into this, that will build this framework and train these Marines. And in 5 years, someone will decide it's too expensive or too complicated, and they'll scrap it all. That I'll have spent 6 months trying to change a system that doesn't actually want to change." "Maybe," Marcus admitted. "Or maybe you'll plant seeds that grow into something bigger than you can see right now. Maybe one of those 25 Marines will become an instructor, and they'll keep it going. Maybe this becomes a new standard instead of the exception. You're optimistic." "Someone has to be," Marcus said with a slight smile. "You're carrying enough cynicism for both of us." That actually got a laugh out of Sarah, brief and surprised, but genuine. Fair point. She sat down on a weight bench, suddenly looking tired. Not just physically tired, but the bone-deep exhaustion that came from carrying weight for too long. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus ventured. You're going to anyway. Why Black Ember? Why did you join a unit that you knew would never be acknowledged, where success meant disappearing, and failure meant dying in a place your family could never visit? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. Hands that pulled triggers, thrown grenades, provided medical aid, and written reports that would never see daylight. Because someone has to do it, she finally said. There are threats out there that can't be handled through conventional means. Situations that require people willing to operate in the shadows, to make choices that would destroy a normal person, to sacrifice recognition for the sake of the mission. She looked up at him. I knew what I was signing up for. I knew the cost. And I still believe that it was worth it, even after everything you've lost, especially after everything I've lost. Her voice was firm, because those losses mean something. They have to mean something. And the only way to ensure that is to make sure the next generation is better prepared, more aware, more equipped to handle the psychological reality of what they're being asked to do. Marcus nodded slowly. That's why you're staying. That's why I'm staying. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sound of rhythmic clinking of weights from a Marine working out in the far corner of the gym. The base was winding down for the night. But here in this space, two warriors, one seasoned, one still learning, shared a moment of understanding. Hey, Marcus said suddenly. The guys from that first morning, Danny and Carter and me, we want to buy you dinner before you officially start the new assignment. Just to say thanks for not completely destroying us for being idiots. Sarah raised an eyebrow. You want to buy me dinner? Well, technically we're splitting it 3 ways and we're thinking the chow hall. But yes, it's the thought that counts, right? That got another laugh. Fine, tomorrow night. But you're telling me the truth about how the barracks reacted when they found out who I actually was. I want to hear the full story. Marcus groaned. It's going to make us sound even worse than you think. Even better. Monday morning arrived hot and humid, the kind of weather that made standing still feel like a workout. The 25 Marines selected for the pilot program assembled in a classroom that had been converted into what Sarah was calling the integration lab, a space designed not just for lectures, but for scenario work, group processing, and the kind of difficult conversations that couldn't happen in a traditional military classroom. Sarah stood at the front, studying each face, lance corporals and corporals mostly, with a few sergeants mixed in, all of them selected because their instructors saw potential for leadership, for adaptability, for the kind of warrior who could evolve beyond what they'd been taught. Marcus was among them, having volunteered for the pilot program despite already having a full training schedule. Good morning, Sarah began. For the next 12 weeks, I'm going to make you uncomfortable. I'm going to challenge assumptions you didn't know you had. I'm going to put you in situations where there is no right answer and ask you to choose anyway. She paused. And I'm going to teach you that being a complete warrior means being just as prepared for the psychological battlefield as you are for the physical one. She gestured to the side of the room, where another person had entered, a tall man in his 50s with a weathered face and eyes that carried the same weight as Sarah's. This is Michael Rodriguez, Sarah said, former Black Ember operator. He's going to be co-teaching this program with me. She paused. He's also the father of a Marine who completed 3 tours in Afghanistan and took his own life 6 months after coming home. The room went silent, the weight of that introduction settling over everyone. Rodriguez stepped forward, his voice rough but steady. My son's name was Anthony. He was a good Marine, a good man, and the system failed him. He looked around the room. I'm here to make sure it doesn't fail you. For the next 12 weeks, Sarah and Rodriguez put the pilot program through a curriculum unlike anything else in the Marine Corps. They ran tactical exercises with moral dilemmas built in. They brought in civilians from countries where Marines had operated and asked them to share their perspectives. They taught cultural sensitivity and language basics. They conducted group therapy sessions where Marines were encouraged to process difficult emotions in real time. They failed half the scenarios they were given. They argued with the instructors. They pushed back on concepts that felt soft or unnecessary. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, they changed. Marcus found himself thinking differently about briefings, about intelligence, about the human cost of tactical decisions. He watched his fellow Marines struggle with questions that had no good answers and saw them emerge stronger for the struggle. He saw stereotypes challenged, assumptions dismantled, and warriors becoming more complete versions of themselves. It wasn't perfect. There were Marines who resented the program, who felt it was weakening them, making them soft. There were moments when Sarah questioned whether any of this would actually translate to the field. There were setbacks and frustrations and days when it felt like they were fighting an impossible battle against entrenched military culture. But there were also breakthroughs. There was a day when a corporal broke down crying while processing a training scenario that had triggered memories of his father's deployment, and instead of being mocked, his fire team gathered around him in support. There was a moment when a lance corporal questioned a briefing during a scenario because something felt wrong, and her instinct saved her team from walking into an ambush. There was a quiet conversation Sarah overheard between two Marines discussing how they'd check in on each other once they deployed, making plans to watch for signs of psychological strain. Small victories. Seeds planted. The final exercise of the pilot program took place on a sweltering Friday in August. The scenario was complex. A humanitarian crisis in a fictional country, with Marines tasked to provide security for an aid convoy while navigating local politics, potential threats, and a civilian population with mixed feelings about American presence. Sarah and Rodriguez observed from the control room as the Marines worked through the scenario. It was messy. Decisions were second-guessed. Communication broke down at points. But what Sarah saw was Marines who were thinking beyond the tactical, who were considering consequences, who were treating the role players like people instead of obstacles. "They're getting it," Rodriguez said quietly, watching the screens. "Not perfectly, but they're getting it." Sarah nodded, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The exercise concluded with a debriefing that lasted 3 hours. Marines discussed what went wrong, what went right, and what they'd learned. They were honest about their mistakes. They were supportive of each other's struggles. And when one Marine admitted he'd frozen during a critical moment because he was trying to remember everything they'd been taught, the group problem-solved together instead of judging him. Colonel Donovan attended the final 30 minutes of the debriefing, observing silently from the back. When it concluded and the Marines filed out, he approached Sarah and Rodriguez. "Well," he asked. Sarah considered her answer carefully. "They're not perfect. They're still going to make mistakes. Some of them will struggle with what they see and do in the field, but they're more prepared than any Marines I've seen at this stage. They're thinking critically. They're considering consequences. They're supporting each other. Good enough to expand the program?" "Yes, sir." Donovan nodded with satisfaction. "The Commandant wants a briefing next month. He's considering making this part of the standard pipeline for all advanced training." He paused. "That would require a permanent position. Someone to oversee implementation across all training facilities." Sarah met his eyes, understanding the implication. "That's more than 6 months. That's a career, different kind of service, but service nonetheless." Donovan's expression softened slightly. "I know what I'm asking. I know what it means to stay connected to this world instead of building a civilian life. But you've proven something here that needs to be proven across the entire Corps. The question is whether you're willing to see it through." Sarah looked at Rodriguez, who gave a small nod, permission, encouragement, solidarity from someone who understood the cost and believed in the cause. She thought about the Black Ember operators who wouldn't ever come back, who'd given everything in the shadows and gotten nothing in return except the knowledge that their sacrifice had mattered. She thought about the Marines she'd trained over the past 12 weeks, now better equipped to handle the reality of modern warfare. She thought about the teacher in Tunisia and the boy in Azerbaijan and the 17 members of her unit who hadn't made it home. "I'll do it," Sarah said, "but I want Rodriguez as co-director. This can't be one person's vision. It needs to be built by people who've lived it." "Done," Donovan said immediately. 6 months later, Sarah stood in front of a different group of Marines at a different base, delivering the same opening speech she'd given at Quantico. But this time, there were 12 other instructors in a room with her, all veterans of Black Ember or similar units, all committed to closing the gap between training and reality. The program had expanded faster than anyone had expected. Word had spread to the Corps about the Marines who completed the pilot program, about how they handled stress differently, thought critically, supported each other. Other commands had requested the training. The commandant had made it official policy. It wasn't perfect. There was still resistance. There were still people who thought it was making Marines soft. There were still casualties, still mental health struggles, still warriors who came home broken. But it was better, measurably better. And that had to be enough. Marcus, now promoted to corporal and serving as an instructor in training, approached Sarah after the briefing. "Ma'am, there's a lance corporal in the new cohort who reminds me of me 6 months ago," he said. "Cocky. Thinks he has it all figured out. I thought you might want to keep an eye on him." Sarah smiled. "What's his name?" "Diaz. Jake Diaz." "Tell me about him." As Marcus briefed her on the new Marine, Sarah felt the weight she carried for so long shift slightly. Not lighter. It would never be lighter. But more distributed, shared across the shoulders of people who understood, who cared, who were committed to making sure the next generation did better. That night, she sat alone in her office reviewing training scenarios for the next day. On her desk was a photo she'd finally allowed herself to display. The 40 original members of Black Ember, taken on a day that officially never happened, in a place that officially didn't exist. 23 faces still alive, 17 gone. Sarah touched the photo gently, tracing the faces of the fallen. "We're doing it," she said quietly to the ghosts. "We're making it mean something." Outside, Marines trained under the lights of the base, their voices calling cadence into the night, the rhythm of preparation, the sound of warriors being forged. And now, for the first time, being forged with not just the skills to fight, but the tools to survive what came after. The Black Ember was dying, a fire that had burned so hot it consumed everything. But from those ashes, something new was growing, something that honored the past by building a better future. And Sarah Chen, the ghost who'd walked onto Quantico thinking she'd observe for 4 weeks and disappear, had found a new mission, a new purpose, a new way to serve. Not in the shadows this time, but in the light, shaping warriors who would be stronger than she'd been, wiser than her generation had been allowed to be, and better prepared for the weight of choices that no training could fully prepare them for. The Black Ember had become a beacon, and the Marines trained on, carrying forward a legacy that would never be officially recognized, but would save lives in ways that could never be counted.